Hello everyone, it's Scott, and today we're going to look at day 3 of Phyrexia All Will Be One spoilers. But before we dig into the spoilers for today, special thanks to Captain and Gamers for sponsoring our video, and remember to like and subscribe to get further content from Phyrexia All Will Be One spoiler season. So today we got a bunch of spoilers, a lot of them lower rarity, so we won't spend as much time on those as we have on some of the rares and mythics that we've seen so far. But let's jump in to see what we've got for today. So first we have Incisor Glider for 1 and a white mana. You get an artifact creature that's a Phyrexian construct. That's a 1/3 with flying, and it has Corrupted, and whenever Incisor Glider attacks, if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control get +1/+1 until the end of the turn. So I think this is more of a limited card in a poison deck, but again, that ability to give every creature you have +1/+1 might make it playable in the poison deck. And certainly, you know, if this had poison on it, I think it would be a better card, but unfortunately it doesn't. So I think it has some playability, but probably mostly a limited card. Next we have Infected Flesh Cutter for a white and a colorless mana. You get a artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and when equipped creature attacks, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with toxic 1, and this creature cannot block. Equip it for 3. So it's got a high cost, but every time you attack with it, it has that ability to create another Phyrexian Might artifact. So and kind of the reason I have these two together is that if you were to put Infected Flesh Cutter onto, say, Incisor Glider or another flyer, the likelihood is that you're going to be able to get through damage unless your opponent can kill that particular creature. So it won't take very long before you've got a little army of Phyrexian Mites. So I can definitely see this being a part of the Toxic deck, especially if there are some flyers in it. Next we have Tamiyo's Immobilizer for 3 and a blue mana. You get an artifact, and Tamiyo's Immobilizer enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. Remove an oil counter from Tamiyo's Immobilizer, tap target artifact or creature. Again, this is probably just, you know, a limited card from the set that you're going to see it play in that. Next we have Veil of Assimilation for a colorless and a white mana. You get an artifact that states when Veil of Assimilation or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains vigilance until the end of the turn. So this is an interesting card in the fact that in an artifact deck where you're going to get a bunch of artifacts that are entering the turn, play turn after turn after turn, or even the Phyrexian Might, this might be a good card in that, but we'll have to kind of see how that deck plays it out. But it's certainly an interesting card in that it can give that creature vigilance and +1/+1 until the end of the turn. Next we have some black cards that we want to talk about today. Not much in black today, just these two. We have first Billowas Skull Dweller for a black mana. You get a Phyrexian insect with Death Touch and Toxic 1. So and it's a 1/1 creature. So, probably the low end curve of potentially the Toxic deck, but outside of that, I don't see it seeing much play. Next we have Feed the Infection for 3 and a black mana. You get a sorcery that you draw 3 cards and you lose 3 life. So in black, drawing 3 cards for 4 mana is not a bad rate at all, and the loss of 3 life here is probably mitigated by other things in your deck. The Corrupted ability is nice. If your opponent has 3 or more poison counters on it, they lose 3 life. So it can do some direct damage as well. So you draw 3 cards, you lose 3 life, your opponent loses 3 life. And if you've been getting poison counters through, probably their life total is already in jeopardy. So it'll be interesting to see if this does see some play in that poison deck as a way to get card advantage. And I can see it as maybe 2 of in that kind of deck. Next we go into red, where we got the most cards today. First, we have Saw Blade Scamp. For a red mana, you get a Phyrexian Beast that's a 1/1 with haste, and when you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Saw Blade Scamp. And you can remove an oil counter from Saw Blade Scamp, and when you do, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you have to tap Saw Blade. So decent ability, probably more of a limited card than anything else, but you know, it has some outside chance of seeing some standard play, but I don't think the ability is good enough without help to get it there. All right, next we have Cacophony Scamp. Also for a red mana, you get a Phyrexian Goblin Warrior. That's also a 1/1. Whenever Cacophony Scamp deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it. If you do, proliferate. So in a proliferate deck, this would probably be a pretty good card. It comes into play on turn 1, you attack with it on turn 2, you attack a few times with it, and you are able to do some early damage in the game. And then when you get to the point where you know it doesn't look like it's going to be able to attack through anymore, then maybe you can attack with it, deal damage, and then proliferate. And when it dies, it does deal damage equal to its power to any target. So there's maybe a little bit of playability here with this one, and that ability to sacrifice it to proliferate I think is the only reason this card might see any standard play. Otherwise I think it's more of a limited card for us. Next we have Oxida Finisher. For 5 and 2 red mana, you get an Org Rebel. That's a 7/5, so very large creature, very large toughness, but the reality is that it's probably going to be too costly for you to cast it for 7 mana in standard. But it does have affinity for equipment. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each equipment you control. So in a dedicated equipment deck, I mean, we are seeing this with Tolarian Terror in the mono blue tempo deck right now. That one wants instants and sorceries in the graveyard. If we do see a dedicated equipment deck that is going to have a lot of equipment on the battlefield, this could easily get down to 3 or 4 mana, where it's very reasonable to then cast it at that point. So if that deck does develop, I could see this as the top end of that deck, and then you attach something that would, and it already has trample. So that affinity for artifact, I think, is the thing that I'm going to be looking for to see if this card is really standard playable. If we get a deck that can be really a strong equipment-based deck, and we're getting more and more equipments that have a creature attached to them, so I think there's a possibility that we're going to see at least an attempt to make that deck work in standard. Next we have Resistance Sky Warden. For 3 and 2 red mana, you get an Orc Rebel. He's a 5/5. He has Menace and Reach. So the abilities are nice, but again, 5 mana in standard in red is a lot. Kind of the current mono red deck that's seen the most play doesn't really go beyond 3 mana for anything, because it just wants to go fast and go underneath your opponent. Next we have Gleeful Demolition for a red mana, which might be the best card we've seen today. This card, I think, is in that position because for a mana you could destroy an artifact. There's going to be a ton of artifacts in standard that are going to see play. So this card, I would say, without reservation, is going to see some standard play. But where I think it fits in best is the Rakdos Sacrifice deck, because Oni Called Anvil already wants to sacrifice artifacts. So you do this, you know, whether it's a synthesizer or some other artifact that you control, you kill your own artifact, it triggers Oni Called Anvil's ability to create a 1/1 artifact creature token. And not only do you get that 1 token, but this then creates 3 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin tokens. So this is an interesting way of potentially flooding the battlefield with a lot of little creatures that can do a lot of damage. And if there's a way that we can buff those creatures to get them to 2/2 or something like that, then I think there's a real possibility that that deck might be a little bit more playable because it's kind of gone out of favor in standard, but I think this is a good place for it. And again, even if you're just using it as a removal spell for your opponent's artifacts, that's a good place for it too. So definitely a mono red sideboard card, and I think even the Grixis stack might want a couple of copies for it as a sideboard card. Next we have Hex Gold Halberd. For 1 and a red mana, you get a artifact that's an equipment. It has the 4 mirrored in ability, so you're going to create a 2/2 rebel creature token when it enters the battlefield, and it will attach itself to that creature. So you get a 2 mana 2/2 for 2 mana. That's pretty good. It's an okay rate for that. And as long as it's your turn, equipped creature has first strike and trample. So if you have a way of buffing this at all, then I think this is a really good card, because having first strike is not typically an ability that red has a lot of. And then I think the key text there is trample. So if we, again, just like I was saying with the Gleeful Demolition, if there's a way we can buff things in red or in other colors that would help these red cards out, I think that's enough to push this into the realm of playability. And certainly I think this card's going to see some playability in any equipment-based deck that we see. We definitely have enough pieces now that I think it's definitely something that we'll definitely see someone trying to get into standard. Whether it's a tier 1 deck or not, I don't know, but certainly it's something that we're going to see. Next we have Volt Charge. For 2 and a red mana, you get an instant. Volt Charge deals 3 damage to any target, and you get to proliferate. I'm not sure where this fits in. Right now the mono red deck doesn't have a lot of things that would need to be proliferated, but if we see it gonna move back towards a place where we're seeing more 1/1/1/1 counters on red creatures, then I think this might be a good inclusion in even a mono red deck for that proliferate ability. Yes, you're paying extra mana for it, but you're in essence paying 1 extra mana to proliferate, which in red, that's not a bad rate at all. Next we have Expand the Sphere. For 3 and a green mana, you get a sorcery, and it looks at the top 6 cards of your library. Put up to 2 land cards from among them onto the battlefield tap, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you put fewer than 2 lands onto the battlefield this way, proliferate a number of times equal to the difference. So this is an interesting ability card. It's a sorcery, so it's kind of slow because you can't cast it at instant speed. But you're putting 2 lands that are onto the battlefield if you need it for the ramp of it, because I mean, yesterday we talked about Tyrannix Rex, that 7 mana green dinosaur that I think we're going to see a bunch of play in standard. So this is a way potentially to ramp even more into that. So now you ramp into this, now you've got 6 mana available. But also there are a bunch of green cards that want to put counters on stuff. So I can see this in that deck as, hey, this is just an easy way to proliferate a few times and increase those counters that we see across cards in the deck. Next we have Noxious Assault. For 3 and 2 green mana, you get a sorcery. Creatures you control get +2/+2 until the end of turn, and when a creature blocks this turn, its controller gets a poison counter. So this is definitely an offensive card, and fortunately it's not at instant speed. Otherwise, I think it'd be really powerful. But what I really see this as is as a limited card. I don't see it because of the 5 mana cost seeing much play in standard. But it's a nice ability in a poison deck, kind of a surprise attack. If you block, you get a poison counter thing. And I think, again, if we do get that dedicated, it looks like it's now green, black, and white that the poison deck would probably fall into, then maybe this is a one I've in it as a surprise attack. Here I'm attacking with my 5 guys, they're gonna kill you, and now I'm doing this, and now you have to make some choices as to how to do things. And I think I like that idea of I've got a few poison counters on you already. I've got enough creatures that I can attack with, and it's going to force you to choose. And I think that's a really great value card in that deck potentially. All right, our last green card here is Unnatural Restoration. For colorless and a green mana, you get a sorcery that returns target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, and you get to proliferate. So again, this proliferate ability. So I think this is going to see some standard play because getting something back from your graveyard is a good ability. And for 2 mana in green, I think that it's not typically something we see in green. Mostly when we see these graveyard return something to your hand abilities or the battlefield, it's in black. So the fact that it's in green, I think, expands the palette of things that it could be in terms of decks. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see it appear a little bit in standard. Certainly in limited, a very good card, because if your opponent kills your best thing, this is a way of getting it back out of that graveyard, and then you get the advantage then of proliferating as well. All right, next we have what I think is the best card of the day, Malcator Purity Overseer. For a white, a blue, and a colorless mana, you get a legendary creature that's a Phyrexian Elephant Wizard. That's a 1/1. And when Malcator Purity Overseer enters the battlefield, create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. So basically you're getting 4 power and 4 toughness on 2 bodies for 3 mana. That is a good situation to be in. And then at the beginning of your end step, if 3 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control this turn, create an additional 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. Now, one of the interesting cards we got yesterday is Encroaching Mycothus. And what this artifact does is that non-land permanents you control are artifacts in addition to their other types. The same is true for permanent spells you control and non-land permanent cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. So basically, if you have this card in play, if you have Encroaching Mycosis in play, then every card that you have that's a permanent becomes an artifact. So if you play a couple cards out, you get three things onto the battlefield. Now you've triggered Malcator's ability. And with token generation, like we've got it, I think it's going to be pretty easy to accomplish that. And the result of that is, I think you can get multiple 3/3 golems off Malcator. Now, is Malcator something that can be easily removed? Absolutely. But the worst case scenario is you've gotten for your 3 mana 3/3 golem. So I think it has a pretty, for the floor on this is a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact. And then the ceiling is that you hit on this turn after turn after turn if your opponent can't remove it. And again, these two cards I think really were meant to go together to have this kind of synergy between the two of them. All right, our last 2 cards of the day are Prosthesis Injector and the Filigree Silex. So let's talk about Prosthesis Injector. For 1 mana, you get an artifact that's an equipment. Equipped creature gets +0/+2 and has Toxic 1. So this is a good card to protect some of your lower mana cost creatures that don't have a lot of toughness. This is a way of increasing their toughness and giving it toxic. So some of those cards that we've already talked about today that had the corrupted ability but didn't have toxic attached to them as well, you can cast this, attach it to one of those cards, and now it has toxic, and that would help then to create the 3 toxic counters that are needed to go ahead and trigger that ability. So I think in that any kind of toxic deck that we're going to have, I think we're going to see this. And again, even in that dedicated artifact artifact equipment deck that we seem to be getting to, this is a pretty good card in that as well, because again, it's going to buff something up, help it to protect it, but also then it pushes that toxic thing on your opponent, and that can be very, very powerful. All right, our last card of the day is the Filigree Silex. For 2 mana, you get this legendary artifact. So basically, you know, it's the same thing we've seen with Urza Silex and Karn Silex. So we've got something very similar to that, but this one has very different kinds of abilities. First, you tap it, you put an oil counter on the Filigree Silex, and then second, you can sacrifice the Filigree Silex, destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of oil counters on the Filigree Silex. So this kind of is a Blast Zone effect. Okay, Blast Zone is a land that we got in the Brothers War that does basically the same thing. You put counters on it, and then whatever is that mana value, you can go ahead and destroy. Now, one of the nice things that this does is you can kill tokens with it. So if you're playing, this might be a good, you know, generally a good sideboard option against a dedicated token deck if we see one in standard, because it can come into play, you tap it, you sacrifice it, you wipe out all of their tokens. And I think because of what we've seen with the Phyrexia Might tokens, that might be more of a thing in standard going forward, at least for a little while. So that's some playability here. But the other thing about this is, yeah, you're going to tap it, you're going to tap it, you're going to tap it, you're going to tap it. And then if you get to 10 oil counters from among, you have 10 oil counters from among permanents you control, you can then sacrifice the Filigree Silex, and it does 10 damage to any target. And I think that is a pretty great ability, because now, you know, when we talk about Karn Silex, we talk about Urza Silex, they're really dealing with the battlefield. Filigree Silex can deal with your opponent. Okay, your opponent, they're, you know, they can, you know, have their life total, you know, knocked down by 10 if we get enough oil counters onto the field. And the important thing here is it doesn't mean that the Filigree Silex has the 10. It just means that they're present among the cards that you have in play. And we did, and I think we're going to continue to see a number of cards that are going to create this. So I think that'll be interesting to see if there's some synergy there, with basically, you know, my goal is to get my opponent down to 10 life, and then hopefully get up to 10 oil counters. And at that point, then I can just go ahead and activate this and kill them immediately when that happens. So this, I think, could be a good thing that would go into that proliferation deck, because once you got a counter on it, every time you're proliferating, you're adding those to it. So I think that's a pretty good place for it. All right, so those are our spoilers for today. So we got some interesting things. A lot of lower rarity stuff, mostly limited playable. But we got a few things that I think at least are discussable and standard for things that you might see. So, you know, is there enough for this equipment deck? Is the toxic poison deck, you know, is it getting some things that are going to help with that? I think we'll have to kind of see how the next few days of spoiler season plays out to figure that out. But again, thanks for staying with me to the end of the video, and thanks to Caffeinated Gamers again for sponsoring our video. And I will see you tomorrow with day 4 of Phyrexia All Will Be One spoiler season.